All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our COVID-19 vaccine town hall. My name is Dr. Farida Griffith, and I am an associate professor of anthropology and sociology, as well as the director for the Global Health Program here at Denison. I will serve as the moderator for the town hall today. It is my pleasure to introduce our two panelists for the town hall. Dr. Abby Norris Turner is an infectious disease epidemiologist at The Ohio State University. Since the spring of 2020, Dr. Norris Turner has been focused on understanding epidemiology of COVID-19 in Ohio. Our second panelist is Dr. Jose Bazan. He is an associate clinical professor of medicine and infectious disease physician at The Ohio State. I thank them both for joining us today. Also, thanks students and faculty and staff for your thoughtful and planningful pre-submitted questions. We will get through as many as possible as we can today, prioritizing those that were most frequently asked. Before I get started on the question and answer for our panelists, I want to provide some foundational information about the vaccine, especially Denison's policy and protocol. Last week, as you know, President Biden announced that the US would have enough vaccines for all adults by the end of May. What does that mean for our community? And when can everyone expect to get a vaccine here on campus? Here's what we know. Denison will not get to decide if and when the vaccines are made available to everyone in our community. The availability of the vaccines, as well as the order of the vaccine distribution, is determined by the state of Ohio. You may have heard that all faculty and staff at colleges and universities in other states have been vaccinated. That is because each state has the autonomy to determine vaccine distribution to their residents, and some have prioritized faculty and staff of colleges and universities. Ohio has not done so yet. The vaccines in Ohio are currently available for certain categories: nursing home and assisted living center employees, K through 12 teachers and employees in certain occupations, as well as childcare services, funeral services, and law enforcement and correctional services, in addition to adults 50 and older, as well as individuals with some medical conditions. Within our campus community, health professionals and first responders have also been eligible for vaccination. Of course, faculty and staff who meet the age criteria have the option to be vaccinated. We also know that when the vaccine is available for the entire community, Denison is set up to be an administrative site, and we will be in position to administer the vaccine right here on campus if the county determines that on-campus vaccination sites is beneficial. Denison has been advocating for this. We also know that students, faculty, or staff will not have to pay anything out of pocket for the vaccine. The federal government is providing the vaccine free of charge. Vaccination providers can be reimbursed for vaccine administration fees by the patient's public or private insurance company, or for uninsured patients by the Health Resources and Services Administration's Provider Relief Fund. So we can guarantee that no one will have to pay anything out of pocket for the vaccine, whether you have insurance or not. Here's what we don't know: when the vaccine will be available for everyone in our community, and the timing is very important for us. If the vaccine is offered in May, for instance, we may not be able to make it available to students because we would need to be able to ensure that they will be on campus for the second dose. The other thing still to be determined is whether whether Denison will require the vaccine. Student pulse survey, 88% of the 738 students who responded said they would get the vaccine if available. 7% said they might get it, and 4% said they do not want it. Of that same population who responded, 76 said the vaccine should be required for students. 14 said maybe it should be required, and 10% felt it should not be required. If the vaccine is required, there would be a process for exemptions. As soon as the information is available about vaccines availability for our campus community, and as soon as the decisions are made about the requirements for the vaccine, we will share them with you. That covers the Denison specific information that I wanted to share. Now I would like to turn it over to our panelists to answer questions related to vaccine development and safety, side effects, new variants, and more. Welcome and thank you for being here, Drs. Norris, Turner, and Bazan. I want to start with a question about how the vaccine, the COVID vaccine in particular, works. They're meant to help our bodies develop immunity to the virus. How does that happen?
Thank you, Dr. Griffith, for inviting us to be here today. So I will take this first question. And you are correct. These vaccines, COVID vaccines, have been designed to help our bodies develop an immune response against this virus. Now, how do they do this? Well, let's take the mRNA vaccines, for example. The mRNA vaccines contain a piece of genetic code, which actually serve as a template or instructions for our own cells to produce a piece of a spike protein, which is actually a piece of the virus that it uses to infect cells. And this is important because then our own cells, when they produce this protein, then our immune system is actually able to ramp up, recognize this, and then prepare itself to help defend us in the future if we were to become exposed to the virus. Now, the Johnson & Johnson or J&J vaccine uses a similar approach, but a different vehicle. And what I mean by that is that it actually uses a common cold virus that is replication incompetent. This means that this virus cannot give you the cold anymore, but it also contains a piece of DNA that produces or encodes for the spike protein that is found in the COVID-19 virus. And then similar to the mRNA vaccines, will prompt our immune system to mount a protective immune response.
Thank you so much. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about vaccine development and safety. Can you review how the vaccines were developed, and specifically, did the rush to develop the vaccine compromise safety?
Yes, thank you. I'll take this one, Dr. Griffith. So this is a really important question, and it's come up many, many times in settings where I've talked about vaccination. So I'm going to start at the beginning of how the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, what kind of data they expect to get when they are looking at a new vaccine product. It's true about drug development as well. And so these are pre-specified rules that have been in place for decades, and they didn't change for the development of the COVID-19 vaccines. So all vaccine development starts at the preclinical stage. That means it's in cells, experiments in cells, and then it moves to animal testing. And then if a product looks promising, it goes into a very small trial called a phase 1 trial that has maybe a dozen people in it, maybe 20 people in it. If that looks good, it goes to a phase 2 trial, which maybe has hundreds of people in it. And if that looks good, it goes to a phase 3 trial, which is the big studies we've been talking about with COVID, which have tens of thousands of participants in them. And the change that happened with the COVID-19 vaccines is that under a normal circumstance, for a normal vaccine development, you would have phase 1 first, and then phase 2 second, and phase 3 after that. For COVID-19, some of the phases happened at the same time. So instead of waiting for some of the data coming out of phase 1 before they moved to phase 2, some of those things happened a bit more quickly. And particularly, it was phase 2 and phase 3 that were combined. But the same safety endpoints that are so essential for understanding if the vaccine is safe were collected, and the same efficacy data to show whether the product is going to prevent disease, those same pieces of data were collected. And by the time the package was handed to the FDA, they had all the same information that they normally have out of any other vaccine product. They just got it faster because of this overlap in some of these phases. I want to say one other thing about the speed of development, which people sometimes forget about when we talk about how quickly these things came. And that is normally when you set up to do one of these trials, especially a big phase 3 trial, you have in mind a research question you're answering, and you're trying to answer that question with a certain degree of precision, right? You want that answer to be accurate, and you want it to be precise. And you power that study statistically with an expected number of people who will develop disease in the placebo arm and also in the vaccine arm. And if the disease is rare, it can take a long time for the expected number of people to get the disease for you to be able to finish the study. Sadly, in 2020, with the degree of spread of COVID-19, we didn't have to wait long, unfortunately, for many, many people to become infected. So the data about efficacy came much quicker, not because of the desire of the scientists to do it fast, but because of the spread of disease worldwide.
Thank you so much. Can you talk about how safe the vaccines are, and how do we know they're can the vaccine give you COVID?
Okay, I'll take those two questions. So, there's been a lot of people who have been vaccinated already. I mean, I'm talking thousands and thousands through clinical trial and then through vaccine rollout. And what we know and have seen is that these vaccines really are very safe indeed. But it should be also noted that it is actually not unusual and even perhaps expected that, a sizable proportion of individuals who get vaccinated will experience some form of mild to moderate post-vaccine side effects. And that can include things like soreness in the arm, fatigue, muscle aches, headaches, and sometimes even fevers or chills. These side effects usually tend to occur within the first 3 days after getting the vaccine. And they basically indicate that your immune system is just mounting a response to the vaccine. They also tend to occur more frequently after the second dose and also in younger individuals. Now, a lot of these mild to moderate side effects actually do not end up preventing people from just going about their daily activities, and they tend to resolve within 1 to 3 days after onset. So I'll tell you, in my experience, I did experience some muscle soreness, fatigue, chills and headaches after getting my second dose of the Moderna. But, I was completely back to normal within a day or two. But overall, in terms of safety, again, these vaccines, so far has been proven to be quite safe, and we continue to monitor, that data over time. I think your second question was, can the COVID vaccines give you COVID? And the answer here is just no, okay? So these vaccines do not contain the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, so they cannot give you the disease. As I mentioned at the beginning, these vaccines, what they contain is just a small piece of genetic code or instructions for one of the proteins that is found in the virus, and then that our immune system was able to recognize and help us develop immunity to that. So another way to think about this is that, the vaccines are providing your body with enough instructions to make cells that can recognize the COVID-19 virus, but they don't have all the instructions to make a full COVID-19 virus. So again, they cannot give you COVID-19.
Thanks so much, Dr. Bazan. So you spoke a bit about the common side effects. I was wondering if either you or Dr. Norris could speak a little bit about the less common ones that we may hear about for the community.
Yeah, I can jump in with that one. As Dr. Bazan stated, the common side effects, are fever and chills, headache, some muscle pain. The really serious side effect that we heard a lot about back in December when people began to be vaccinated, we heard a lot, it's anaphylaxis, right? It's this very severe allergic reaction that people were rightly focused on, because if that would have been a common side effect, that would have been very troubling. But the good news about that is it's an exceedingly rare side effect. It happened 21 times in the first 1.9 million doses of Pfizer vaccine that were administered. So that's about 1 in 100,000 doses that led to anaphylaxis. But because of the concern, because it's a serious side effect, this is why after you get vaccinated, you stay for 15 to 30 minutes and are observed, because it's a serious enough side effect that you wouldn't want people to leave the vaccine site if they would experience it by themselves, right? So it's very rare, but it's also very carefully measured and monitored.
So new, should individuals be concerned about the possibility of long-term effects that can't yet be known, especially with regards to things like fertility?
Yeah, I can jump in on this one. So the first thing I want to say is that when people say they're worried about long-term side effects of COVID vaccination, I think it's really important to say that's reasonable, that's understandable. There's a lot of things we don't know about COVID, the disease, and also we can't know because of the newness of this infection and the newness of the vaccines. It just isn't possible to have 5 years of follow-up data on a single person following them forward in time to look at potential downstream vaccine side effects. But what we do have, what Dr. Bazan alluded to a minute ago, is now millions and millions of people who have been vaccinated and who have been followed for what adds up to many years of time, right? If you look at all of the months of time that they've been followed, you begin to get a sense of what kinds of side effects are going to emerge. Because most people, the vaccine side effects for other vaccines that emerge, they happen right away. They don't happen for most vaccines, months or years down the line. So it really is that early time period for most vaccines that you look at to understand about safety data. All that being said, because this is such an important public health issue, there are many, many people looking at these vaccine side effects to be able to answer this question. I want to talk specifically about your question about fertility, because this has come up in a few other places, and I really wanted to understand kind of where that was coming from. So it's not true that the COVID vaccines affect future fertility. And in getting ready for this talk, I looked back into the literature to understand really if there's any vaccination that's known to affect future fertility. And there is actually no vaccine that is approved and used in the United States or anywhere that is known to affect future fertility. So that was just like an important reminder for us that this is a concern that has been raised for other vaccines. It's reasonable that people feel fearful about it, but it isn't based on any data that we have. But it also kind of emerged in an interesting way. And so there was a social media post that highlighted this fact that as Dr. Bazan noted, the vaccines target something called the spike protein on coronavirus. There are other biological processes that also use spike proteins, and one of them has to do with the development of the placenta during pregnancy. And so this idea began that the spike protein that was targeted by the COVID vaccines could also potentially target this other spike protein that's used in a completely other process. It's a completely other protein. It really has nothing to do with SARS-CoV-2, but that this could potentially be targeted by the vaccine. So the data don't bear it out, but when you begin to just try to put pieces together, it sounds at first like it might be plausible. And in this particular case, it isn't.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, shifting gears just a bit, I'd like to address effectiveness of vaccine. Can you talk a bit about the overall effectiveness and then the different effectiveness levels of the various vaccines that are or will be soon available?
Okay, so the question is, could we talk about the overall effectiveness and the different effectiveness levels of the various vaccines that are or will be available? So very similar to what we just discussed in terms of the fact that these vaccines are have proven to be very safe. I think there's very, very good data showing that they're also very effective, particularly at preventing symptomatic COVID-19. So take the vaccines of Pfizer and Moderna, for example, which have been shown to be about 95% effective in preventing symptomatic disease. If you now look at the J&J vaccine that we talked about before, and is the newest vaccine to be granted emergency use authorization by the Food and Drug Administration. It was reported to be 66 or so percent effective in preventing symptomatic COVID-19 disease in a very large and global phase 3 clinical trial. Actually 72% if you actually look at the US population in that trial. However, when you look at these numbers, you have to keep in mind that this is really not an apples to apples comparisons, because these trials happen at different times. And actually the J&J vaccine trials happened at a time when COVID-19 cases were much higher. So we were really at a peak of the pandemic. And then we also had the circulating variants of concern, happening around. So when you actually think about the J&J vaccine, for example, really the number that jumps out at me is the 85% effectiveness in preventing severe and critical COVID-19 disease, and very, very high levels of protection against hospitalizations and death. So in reality, this is something that, folks need to keep in mind, because, if you get the chance to be offered a vaccine, that has such a high level of protection from getting you, from protecting you from getting severe COVID-19 that could potentially land you in the hospital, I think that ultimately is a very, very good vaccine indeed.
Thank you so much. What do we know about the length of protection provided by the vaccines? How soon are you protected after the final dose? So the second dose for the Pfizer and Moderna, as well as the one dose for the Johnson & Johnson. I just want to kind of have an idea of how necessary for either one, two, or all three of the vaccines that are currently available.
Yeah, I can jump in on this and talk a little bit about the duration of protection from the vaccines, and also what we understand about booster shots and so forth. So to take those questions a little bit in a different order. So the first one is, how soon after you get the vaccine are you protected? And the answer to that is 2 weeks after the second dose for the 2-dose vaccines, so Pfizer and Moderna, and 2 weeks after the single dose for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So it's always 2 weeks after the latest is when you'll be fully protected from the vaccine. And we don't yet know how long the protection will last. I know it's disappointing to be in these presentations and have somebody come and say that, but I think it's one of the most responsible things as an expert in this area is to talk about what we don't know. And this is one of the areas that we don't know. So just as we don't know how long the protection is from natural infection, the immunity that we get from natural infection, which appears to be months long, but not forever. We also don't know with vaccines how long that protection will last. The question that you asked about boosters is a really useful one as well. So we heard a lot about boosters when people began talking about the variants, because those vaccines were developed when there were sort of some dominant circulating strains, then the vaccines are effective against those strains. And then when new variants came out, people began to say, well, maybe a booster can address the vaccine responsiveness now to the variants. And there's still some discussion about that, but I think a lot more of the focus at this moment is getting the existing vaccines that we already have into the arms of people before we would invest in the logistical exercise of bringing back people who've got some level of protection for a booster vaccine. It's probably the case that at a future time, we will all need to get more COVID vaccination in order to, kind of renew our immunity against whatever the circulating strains are. But whether that's going to happen annually or every 5 years, those things are really not yet determined.
Can you talk a bit about the differences between Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, as well as the Johnson & Johnson vaccine?
Okay. So the question is, any difference, or could I talk about some of the difference between Pfizer, Moderna, and the J&J vaccine? So besides what I already mentioned in terms of, the components of the vaccine and their effectiveness, there's, some nuances or variants, for example, with regards to, temperature requirements for storage and shipment, that have been sort of worked out need to be kept in mind, for individuals that are going to be vaccine providers. But the other important point in terms of difference has to do with the number of doses of the vaccine that are needed or required to be considered fully immune. And Abby talked about that here a little bit. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines require 2 doses, and individuals are then considered fully vaccinated 14 days after the second dose. For the Pfizer, there is the first and the second dose are given 21 days apart, while for the Moderna, the first and the second dose are given 28 days apart. The J&J vaccine, is a one-shot vaccine, single dose, and folks are considered fully immune 14 days after that. And I think vaccines that can be given as a one shot, can offer the big advantage of help us to sort of expand or help our ability to get more people fully vaccinated, at a faster rate.
We talked a bit about the differences between the 3 vaccines. Can we spend a little time thinking about and talking through the effectiveness of the vaccines as it relates to the new variants that have been part of the conversation most recently?
Yes, I'm happy to jump in on this one. So the question is about the vaccines and how effective they are against some of the new variants that have been identified. And this is an area, like a lot of COVID research, where there's new information every day, both about the existence and the prevalence of variants around the country, around the world, and also about the vaccine's ability to prevent disease caused by those variant strains of SARS-CoV-2. So a little bit of background about how we understand how vaccines work against variants. There's kind of 2 sources of information. One of them comes from lab experiments where essentially in cells or using blood or other products from people who have been infected with SARS-CoV-2, there are a series of lab experiments which show what is the likely immune response in a person who's exposed to one of these variants. It's sort of measured in terms of the titer of those immune cells and how rapidly and vigorously the response is generated. And the second sort of kind of information is to look where those variants are spreading and where some people have been vaccinated and how much those people appear to be protected against disease in those particular areas. And that second type of data, the real world data, is much more valuable because it really shows us what would happen to vaccinated humans in those circumstances as opposed to Petri dishes. But it's also harder to get those data because we don't have very good systems, certainly in the US, but even worldwide, to know in real time which variants are in which places, right? So it's just really hard to stay one step ahead of the virus there. But I'll share with you a little bit about what we know from these 2 types of evidence. So the first one is, as Dr. Bazan mentioned earlier, the Pfizer vaccine is about 95% effective against COVID-19, and that was tested on the sort of quote unquote original strains, the original circulating strains through the early part of 2020. In real world observations, these are observations mostly from Israel, it also appears to work about as well against what we call the UK variant, the B.1.1.7 variant. But we only have the laboratory type of experiments to look at how well the Pfizer vaccine works against the South African variant. And just this morning, there was a new study about the Brazilian variant. And both of those suggest that the Pfizer vaccine works a little bit less well against those variants. The Moderna vaccine, as we said earlier, is also about 95% effective against the original circulating strains of COVID-19 or of SARS-CoV-2, but we don't have a lot of real world data showing the effectiveness or change in effectiveness of the Moderna vaccine against these other variants. The lab data also show that it's probably about as effective against the UK variant and probably a reduced immune response against the South African variant. And there's no data about the Brazilian or other variants. And then just to end with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, as Dr. Bazan said, it's about 66% effective overall, 72% in the US. And again, that vaccine was tested in places where some of these variants are spreading, which is probably why it looks a bit less effective than the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines because of these other variants. And we don't know what the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines would look like if they'd been tested in the same areas that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was tested in. And it's new enough that we don't actually yet have strong data looking directly at specific variants. We mostly just know about Johnson & Johnson because one of the vaccine sites was in South Africa, and it had somewhat reduced efficacy in that site. So the most important thing to say about the variants, though, just to end on where we are with vaccination, is the best way to keep there being new and dangerous variants from circulating is to keep COVID from circulating, right? The more people who get vaccinated, the less disease there is circulating, the less opportunity there is for development of new variants, which may not be susceptible to future vaccination.
So we've talked a bit about the variants, and now I want to bring it home a little bit and talk or discuss, and maybe both of you can address, how do individuals know which vaccine they will receive? Would Denison get to choose what vaccine it makes available to the campus community?
Okay. I can start with that. So just to repeat the question, so it is, how do individuals know which vaccine they will receive, and how would institutions such as Denison, in this case, would it get to choose the vaccine that it makes available to its campus? So, and you mentioned, you touched on this a little bit at the beginning, ultimately, as of now, the state of Ohio really is deciding, vaccine allocation based on supply and availability. So an individual or a vaccine provider, for example, may not, have the option or necessarily get to choose, which vaccine they are going to take or provide. But I sort of want to go back to that point that I made earlier and stress that, individuals really should not give up the opportunity to get vaccinated under the pretext that they just want to wait for a better vaccine to become available. As we talked about earlier, the 3 vaccines that have been granted emergency use authorization by the FDA here in the US, are all very good at preventing severe COVID-19. So folks really should not pass up on that opportunity, to get a vaccine that can really protect them against, getting very sick and even potentially dying from this infection.
I know a lot of people in our community will probably want to know the answer to this question. So, no 19 after getting the vaccine.
Okay, so if I heard the question correctly, I think this, could you get COVID-19 after getting the vaccine? And actually, this is a very good question because, at the very beginning, once the data for vaccine effectiveness started coming out, we knew that these vaccines were very effective in preventing symptomatic COVID-19, but we didn't know, for example, could person or individuals still get the virus, maybe not develop any symptoms, but still potentially pass it on to somebody else. So data is starting to come out showing that these vaccines can actually help prevent that. And we are still waiting for more data to come out. Now, with that said, we also have to be, pretty clear that, vaccinated individuals, have been reported to come down with COVID-19, again, despite vaccination. This is actually not surprising. No vaccine or, a lot of vaccines are not 100%. And we see, with other vaccines that individuals can still, become infected with whatever pathogen may be involved despite being vaccinated. But the key point here is that even if somebody who has been vaccinated, comes down with COVID-19, that vaccine can still afford a level of protection for that person to not become sick enough to have to go to the hospital or end up on a ventilator or potentially dying from the infection. So again, that is something very important to remember.
The next topic is a big one, and we received a lot of questions about it. What happens after individuals are vaccinated? We saw most recently yesterday, the CDC provided guidelines for vaccinated Americans. And, what can individuals, expect life to look like post vaccination? Will mask and distancing still be required? What are your inputs on that?
Yeah, so I'm happy to jump in on this one, and I'll say what I've said a couple times already, but I'll probably say it a couple more times, which is these things can always change, right? So it's changed in between the time we planned this session and this moment. So things can always be updated, but it's exactly right. CDC yesterday released updated guidance related to vaccination and behavior after vaccination, and so I think there's two really important pieces that I took from that updated guidance. The first one, to state it simply, is that fully vaccinated people, so people who are 2 weeks after their second dose for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, or 2 weeks after their Johnson & Johnson vaccine, fully vaccinated people can be indoors and unmasked and within 6 feet of one another if all of the people who are there are also fully vaccinated. So they're very clear to say, like, no house parties, no indoor concerts, no large group gatherings, but a small indoor gathering where everybody is fully vaccinated is now acceptable. This is an enormous change if you think back over the last 12 months. The second important category that they talk about in that guidance is that fully vaccinated people can also be with unvaccinated but low risk people within a single household. So the scenario here to think of is like grandparents going to visit grandchildren in another household. The grandparents are fully vaccinated. They're 2 weeks after their second dose. The grandchildren will not be able to be vaccinated for many months yet, but children in general have a very low risk of serious outcomes from COVID. And CDC has said it's really the older people in this situation that we're trying to protect. Those older people are protected by the vaccine. We won't be as worried about the risk to the younger children in that scenario. So those are really the two big updates that have to do with how vaccination changes our risk mitigation. Everybody else, vaccinated and unvaccinated, in all of the other public settings that we engage in, at the grocery store, at the bank, going to school, we'll continue to wear masks, we'll continue to do distancing and hand washing and all of the other things that we've become good at over the last 12 months. It's really just these two much more specific situations where the rules have changed a bit.
So it's needless to say, masks are here for a while, and social distancing is here for a while. What percentage of the population will need to be vaccinated in order for mask and distancing not to be necessary?
Yeah, so the answer to this question sort of follows along to what Dr. Norris Turner just talked about. So ideally, we want to get to the point of herd immunity that we can start relaxing some of the broad measures of protection, that have been in place to keep the virus at bay, for the last year or so. And, as Dr. Norris Turner mentioned, we are starting to see some of the positive effects that vaccines can afford us with regards to getting back to some semblance of pre-pandemic normalcy. Now, with regards to herd immunity, which, we should be clear that, involves a combination of immunity derived from natural infection and vaccination, a 70 to 80% threshold has been proposed. However, there are really many factors that are at play with regards to herd immunity, including, how long does natural or vaccine induced immunity last? So we're still learning, a lot about, some of these immunologic correlates. So these numbers, really that are being proposed may potentially change as we continue to learn more about the virus, and particularly the variants. So I think really the bottom line here is that we really should try everything, and anything that we can do to get as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible so we can reach a high level of immunity threshold in the population at large.
I'm sure you can see where this question is coming from, and so I will actually offer the question and then I'll answer it so that our sector of the population can hear this. What about socializing with others who have been vaccinated? Could students gather in small groups in their rooms and not be required to wear their mask and distance if everyone in the group has been vaccinated? And so our key to this is that Denison will continue to follow CDC guidelines regarding mask and distancing for those with and without the vaccine. We will adjust our campus social and travel guidelines accordingly if we have mass vaccination on our campus. And then also following CDC guidelines and recommendations from our partners at The Ohio State University. So I want to move the conversation now to just a little bit more on the topic of variants. Can you give a high level overview of those and what we know about them?
So, and Dr. Norris Turner sort of mentioned this or described this a little bit ago. So, in terms of the variants, much like other viruses, RNA viruses, it's actually not surprising that the COVID-19 virus is able to mutate, evolve over time, and then spread within a population. So again, we know that this happens with other viruses. So one of the main concerns that we have with these variants, for example, like the ones found in the UK or South Africa or Brazil, it's not only the potential for increased transmissibility or, could it spread from one person to another much easier, but, could they also cause increased disease severity? And as Dr. Norris Turner had mentioned, how effective are our vaccines going to be, against these variants? But in reality, new data is emerging all the time. And, and for example, the question about, increased disease severity, there's probably many factors that play into that and not necessarily just the virus itself. So we are still learning a lot, about these variants, and, and hopefully we'll have more information in the near future.
Okay, so now we know the details about development, safety, efficacy. Can you talk about why you recommend individuals get vaccinated? Specifically the COVID-19 vaccine.
Okay. So I think, I think individuals, should get these vaccines because they're ultimately a crucial tool to help manage, this terrible pandemics. Again, the vaccines are safe. They can keep people from getting very sick or having to go to the hospital. So ultimately, if our goal is to ease back a lot of these restrictions that have now been in place for a long time, then we really need to build up immunity through vaccination. Vaccination, again, will play a big part in that, in order to achieve that goal.
What do you say to those who are hesitant or don't trust vaccines, have concerns that vaccines are so new, we don't know the long-term effects? And then to couple with that, are there populations who should not get the vaccine, including those who have already had COVID-19?
So I'll talk a little bit about hesitancy about the vaccine, and I'll defer the question about who should get it to the clinician, since he's more qualified than I to answer that one. So yes, I wanted to talk about vaccine hesitancy and to people who feel concerned about getting the vaccine. And I think the most important thing to say in response to this is that it's okay to be concerned about getting a vaccine. This is a decision that people have to make about what they put into their own bodies, and they want to feel comfortable with that choice. People have a lot of different experiences themselves personally and their families with the medical system, and not all of those are positive experiences, and they may not have a physician that they trust whom they can speak about the vaccine with. And I think there are a lot of efforts happening right now to address some of those concerns that people have. And I encourage people who are feeling hesitant to listen to those groups that are trying to talk about it, but also to try to engage with someone whom you trust. This could be your doctor if you have one. It could also be a trusted educator. It could be a medically or scientifically minded colleague or a friend, someone who you really believe has your best interests in mind, someone you can ask the questions of multiple times to make sure you understand what they're telling you, that you can hear the words, that, the responses in a number of different ways until you feel you've really had your questions answered. Myself, I feel confident and comfortable with the safety of the vaccine, but I recognize that I'm coming from a different perspective than a lot of other people. It was really sensible to me that there were people who had reservations and wanted to wait when the vaccines first came. They didn't want to be in the first wave to see what would happen. And I think many people in that position, now that millions of people have been vaccinated, are now feeling more confident because they've seen more data out in the world that these vaccines are safe. But I think that that's fine that people wanted to wait and see that happen. I do think the data now are strongly supportive of safety, but I also think that my personal opinion is that these are decisions people have to come to on their own when they're ready to do them. And people around you encouraging you and telling you that you must get vaccinated isn't a way to make people feel supported and confident about the safety of the data. It doesn't actually help, and it shouldn't be our approach.
I think the next question was, are there populations who should not get the vaccine, including those who already had COVID-19? So to address the first one in terms of, folks that should not get the vaccine. So the CDC recommends that, individuals with a history of severe allergic reactions, such as anaphylaxis, which I know, we discussed earlier, to either a component of the vaccine or after a previous dose of a COVID-19 vaccine, those individuals then should not get vaccinated. But I do want to reiterate what Dr. Norris Turner had mentioned before, is that all individuals, who receive the COVID-19 vaccine are monitored for at least 15 minutes and sometimes even up to 30 minutes after injection to make sure that they are okay. Now, the second part of the question, which is, what about the individuals who have had COVID-19 already? So the CDC recommends that, individuals who have had COVID-19 still should be considered for vaccination. And we know that natural infection or natural COVID-19 does provide you with some protection against reinfection for a period of time. However, we think that the immune response that is elicited or triggered by vaccination could potentially be better or more robust. So that's why the recommendation is in place that even though if you've had COVID-19 in the past and you have recovered, you have cleared the period of the required period, met criteria to come off isolation, then you are eligible to get vaccinated.
So this is part of a bigger question, I think, that's really our community is really interested in. Can we expect COVID-19 to ever go away? Here we are a year from when you kind of saw our worlds really change. And I think part of our students, our faculty, and our staff are really, I think the world has been affected by COVID-19. Will it be eradicated at some point?
So I don't want to say never, but it's not going away soon. So we'll have COVID-19 with us for some time. It will fade. It will not be the kind of focus that it has been for this last year. We will develop better treatments for people who become sick. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of amazing that our vaccine development just completely leapfrogged the development of effective medications to treat COVID-19. That does not usually how that happens. So there will be a lot more work that happens related to COVID, but it isn't going away anytime soon.
Do you recommend taking any medication, for instance, pain relievers, to help manage the side effects from the vaccine?
Thank you. So that is a good question, which actually comes up, fairly often. So, right now it is not recommended that people, take things like Tylenol or ibuprofen before taking the vaccine with the hopes of preventing some of the known, post-vaccination symptoms that we have described before. However, it is okay to take these types of medications after the vaccine has been provided, if the symptoms develop and are severe enough, that they warrant such medications. Again, if they are medically appropriate. But, we always encourage folks to reach out to their medical providers, for specific guidance, when questions like this come up.
So I think for our final question for today, I was wondering if either one of you could speak a bit about, and you talked a bit about it in the beginning, about, we know the vaccines are right now for 16 and older, one of them, and then the other is 18 and older. And so can we speak a bit about about vaccines for children? Where do we see that going? What's the timeline in terms of thinking about the under 16 in some cases and under 18 in other cases? Population.
Yeah, so I can say a little bit, and Dr. Bazan, jump in if you have more on this. So the Pfizer vaccine is approved for 16, 17, and 18 and older. The Moderna vaccine is approved just for 18 and older, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is approved for 18 and older. All three of those companies are starting trials for 12 and older. Some of those have been a little bit harder to enroll in, so it's been a little bit slower to accrue participants to kind of generate data in those trials. But there's still the expectation that there will be data kind of by the middle of the summer, with the idea that if it were approved, that those 12 and older could be vaccinated before the start of the next school year. So again, everything could change, but that's the tentative timeline. But then it will be sort of nearing the end of those trials when there's a suggestion that they work in the 12 and olders, if that is what the data show. Then the trials will start in the littler kids. So it's still some time out before we'll have data and certainly vaccine approvals for the elementary and younger age children.
And I agree with that. I know my wife keeps asking me, when is the vaccine going to be available for our kids? And, I keep telling her, soon, hopefully soon.
Well, I said we had time for just one more, but I think can we sneak one more in? I think this was a question that our community wanted answered. In terms of the reported deaths in Norway, can you share any insight on the reported deaths of the elderly who received the vaccine in Norway?
Yes, I can answer this question. So, and actually I can just talk a little bit about, I think some other folks have been interested in understanding about how deaths connect in the data to vaccination kind of more broadly. So the situation in Norway is that there were 23 elderly people in a kind of the equivalent of a nursing home setting who died after getting a vaccine in Norway. And people were reasonably really concerned about that. And so it turns out that everywhere in the world, including in Norway, the people offered the vaccine first, in addition to medical providers, were the oldest and most frail in community, in society. And that included people in nursing homes, including in the US and Ohio. And sadly, that population has a very high death rate relative to the rest of the population. So people are more likely to die just by being old and frail, regardless of their vaccination status. And so in Norway in particular, 400 people die, elderly people die each week in nursing home facilities. So 23 people dying over the course of vaccine administration isn't a standout number, very sadly for those families, but very unlikely to be related in this case to direct vaccine effects. I just wanted to say one other thing about deaths in people who have been vaccinated more broadly. The CDC or the FDA tracks vaccine deaths. And of course, with COVID-19, they're watching these data extremely carefully. And so these numbers, so pardon me for looking at my notes, but between December 14th and March 1st, there were 1,381 deaths, so 1,381 deaths reported in the United States in people who had had a COVID vaccine out of 76 million doses of vaccine that had been administered. And that includes people who died after their vaccine, who died of heart attacks or car accidents, cancer. Some of them got COVID after they'd had the vaccine, but before they were immunized, and they died of COVID, right? And so the data is the people who died having been vaccinated, but not the number of people who died from the vaccine. And in fact, through autopsy, medical records, and all kinds of other reporting that's been done on each of those deaths, the FDA has not been able to conclusively link the vaccination in particular to deaths from the vaccine, or deaths connected to the vaccine. Yeah.
I really want to just thank Doctors Norris, Turner, and Bazan for your thorough and helpful answers to our questions. Our students, faculty, and staff really provided a lot of great questions, and I think we covered a lot in this last hour. We will have recorded this session, and we'll make it available on our Reopen site. We also have a vaccine FAQ section on the site under Health and Testing tab. We will continue to update students, faculty, and staff on vaccine availability via President Weinberg's weekly emails and communications from Dr. Alex Miller. Should we be in position, we'll have another town hall to answer your questions. As always, you can email questions at any time to reopen.denison.edu. Thank you and be well.